Learn how to become a better game master by studying stories.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. If you don't know who I am, my name is Matt Davids. I am the creator behind the Books of Random Tables. You may have seen them on Amazon.com, on DriveThruRPG.com. I create random tables to help game masters cut down their prep time. You can also find my books at my own website, which is DiceGeeks.com. Now, when we are trying to learn how to become better game masters, I think it is critical that we study stories and look at how stories are told. I have a returning guest today who thinks a lot about storytelling, and we have a wide-ranging conversation that touches on tons of tips and tricks that will help improve your campaigns. So let's dive into the episode. My guest today is the host of the Fictitious podcast, Adron Buske. Adron, welcome back on the show.
Hey, I'm really excited to return to this.
Yeah, it was great having you on last time, and it will be fun to talk to you again, I am sure. So last time, since you do a podcast about authors and the writing of books, we kind of talked about using techniques that authors use when writing novels. We talked about using those in tabletop role-playing games. And so we are just going to kind of continue along that. One topic that we had wanted to talk about is creating compelling villains. And I'm sure everybody knows that if your villain is not compelling, then your story will probably fall flat. And we can always probably just think of the first time we saw Star Wars A New Hope and Darth Vader walks in for the first time. We just know he is going to be a great villain. So since you interview so many authors on your podcast, what are some of your thoughts about creating compelling villains?
Well, I mean, first off, I think that when you read novels or watch movies that have great villains, they stand out. They're oftentimes one of the most memorable things. I mean, if you look at like the high water mark is like you said, Darth Vader or the Joker or these characters. Like a lot of the DC villains are often awesome. And then if you have stories where they're not there, like a few of the Marvel movies that have kind of nothing villains that you can't even remember the names of, or like the recent Justice League movie that has, I don't know, a big CGI guy nobody cares about. You can definitely see where a story can fall apart, even if you have great heroes. If you don't have a counterpoint with them, your story will suffer for it. I think in a lot of role-playing games, you can end up with a similar thing where you can have a lot of cannon fodder bad guys, and you can have you can have really impressive stat blocks with cool names and cool art that are can be fun to fight. And afterwards, you're like, yeah, we took out that big, I don't know, thing. I mean, and it'll be like they're just a disposable big bad that didn't necessarily have any story behind them. And when there's no story behind them, there's nothing really to talk about it afterwards. I mean, occasionally you'd be like, yeah, sweet, like the barbarian took out the dragon with his big hammer. That was a cool moment. And those moments make a lot of what we talk about, with games after they're over. But really what matters most is the shared story. And that gets so much better when you have a great villain. So, I mean, when we talk about defining characteristics for villains, one of the things that comes up a lot is that in a lot of the best villains are essentially sort of like an opposite. You use the phrase like equal and opposite, but it's really more like opposite and slightly more than equal. Because if they were just the equal of the good guy, there wouldn't be as much of a struggle, right? They got to have some kind of upper hand. But if you've got sort of a mirror image of them, that helps. And in role-playing games, you're not necessarily going to have just like one competitive nemesis, that you're going to be running up against over and over, like the same way that like comic books do. Because one, it would get repetitive. Two, eventually you'd be like, yeah, we're D&D adventurers. We kill things. We don't just let that guy get away, or whatever it is. Depending on your crowd. I mean, like I know some people, like my own gaming group a couple of times early on tried to do the good thing, and we just captured guys, and eventually they came back and hit us again. And the next time we were less kind to them.
Yeah. I was going to say it is very difficult usually in tabletop role-playing games to introduce a recurring villain if the players come in contact with them, because usually then the players are just like, whoa, this guy is bad news. We got to deal with him right now. And then it's like, I never have a recurring villain because they kill him right then.
Right. Yes. There's a pragmatism to sword and sorcery worlds, which is, you don't have as much of a wall between you and taking ultimate measures, essentially. And yeah, if anybody is clearly the bad guy, you're like, well, we'll murder him because that's what you do, right? And is he a monster? Well, then even better. We have no compulsions, or no compunctions about doing that. Like, as long as it fits my alignment, we're fine. Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah, in creating a character that will be an antagonist long term in a story, then I think it requires a certain level of consideration for both like how they're introduced, whether they're introduced in a way that makes them relatively benign or puts their station well above the character, so that there's something that that keeps them kind of off limits, whether a powerful political figure has some level of influence or related to somebody that they know that like, oh, if we kill this person, we lose an ally, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So you definitely kind of have to build in some complications for a reoccurring character, so that there's the characters aren't immediately inclined to just go into full murder hobo mode. And I think it's layering consequence around them. And I mean, that matters from a story perspective in general anyway, is that if your characters are running through things like they're in a video game on God mode and they feel no consequence, then there's going to be no weight to any of their actions, and none of it will matter. So yeah, that's definitely a thing you have to consider with villains in general. But I think more than anything, regardless of whether your villain shows up a bunch of times, only shows up a few times, is something that they mostly hear about. It's considering the villain as a character on their own and not just a mechanic. I think, and this is something that happens to people when they first start writing, or if they first start making comic books or start running their own games, the bad guy is just a bad guy. It's like he's like sort of like an AI bot running the background, and who's like, I is bad, I will cause bad things. And that gives your player character somebody to fight against, to struggle against, but it doesn't make them interesting, and it doesn't make story. So it's really sitting down and thinking about what does this villain want? What does this antagonist want? And it shouldn't just be, I want to stop the good guys from doing the thing they want to do. That should be largely unless they are just a character who is created entirely just to be a pain in their butt, which there's room for that as well. But they really should have a goal of their own, a mission of their own, a reason to do all the things that they do. And they should have their own personal justification for doing the awful things they do. And a lot of the author conversations I've had, and this is also, we do whole panels about villains at some of the comic conventions and stuff that I go to, when those still exist, since right now they don't.
Yeah. If we ever have a convention again.
Right, yeah. Well, when we're allowed to gather more than 10 people again together. But we talk about what makes a great villain, and one of the things that we talk about it both for what makes them great in a story, but why people are drawn to them. Because we can look at the bad guy and be like, that person's terrible. I'd never liked them in real life, but as a character, I find them so compelling. And it's that and this relates to what we were talking about with the player characters earlier. In real life, we have our own lines we won't cross. We have our own rules, whether it's being a lawful good and following everything that that society tells us to do, or if it's just having our own moral codes or layers of consequence we don't want to deal with. A villain is a person whose own sense of personal justification surpasses anybody else's rule system. So they might have their own sense of honor. They might have their own sense of following a code. But when they really want something, other people's lines are not something they feel like they should have to stop at. And so I think figuring out your villain from a character standpoint and figuring out why they feel justified to cross those lines, why it's important that they do so. And especially if you can find things that are more than just, oh, they want power, oh, they just want wealth. If you can figure out something that really makes them interesting, you'll have much cooler story hooks, and you will maybe have things that get more complicated for your player characters, because a megalomaniac tyrant who just wants to rule everything and enslave people is a pretty easy villain to want to go, chop up with your power axe. Is a power axe a thing? I don't know. Like your +5 axe of smiting or whatever. Yeah. But if that same villain is driven by things that the characters can kind of get on board with or can kind of understand, sympathize with to a certain degree, or if the 100% sum of their actions is not evil. I think when you've got a bad guy who has a certain, he's kind of doing something for the greater good, even though he's doing something awful, or he perceives it as the greater good, that makes things a lot more complicated. It's like, have you read Watchmen?
No, I have not read it.
Okay, so I mean, that's the classic Alan Moore, Dave Gibbons comic book. There's a film. There's a TV series on HBO that's loosely based on it. But there's a I won't give away too much then, but there's a character in that does exactly that thing. He does the worst possible thing with the best of intentions. And I think that is a fascinating place to examine a character, and in particularly in creating an antagonist for, if you want to really cause some mixed emotions that will make something more dynamic, more interesting, that's an angle to kind of pursue.
Yeah. And I certainly think, looking into the villain's motivations, looking into what kind of their story is, certainly will take them out of the realm of kind of comic book villain or something like old style comic book villain, and put them into kind of the newer kind of idea. Because you can't say comic book villain anymore, because now they're super complex. Right? They might have been two-dimensional, in 1934 or something like that, but they're not anymore. And just kind of thinking of some of the points in there you mentioned, kind of about the recurring villains. I think I've tried almost everything. It's just like, I had a cool villain. Well, of course, he comes in contact with the player characters, and they kill him. Because they know I'm going to try to bring him back. So they want to eliminate him. So then I've tried, just in a practical sense, to say, oh, well, he had a boss. He had a boss that was pulling his strings, and you didn't know that. And now, we can kind of pull the characters along with that. And then I've also tried kind of like a movie style thing where the player characters don't get to interact with the main villain, but basically they get to see some cutscenes with the villain doing some things, kind of like the audience would in a movie, because, our heroes don't see Darth Vader enter the ship, over Tatooine. The audience does, and we get the emotional impact there as the audience. And then certainly looking into, their motivations or their backstories. And I think a common kind of way, especially in, say, like a Star Wars type thing, a common way to then make the villain even more compelling is to make them, the person's father, the hero's father, or something like that. Of course, that lends itself to a little bit towards melodrama, and but it can still accomplish the purpose. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing, I mean, I to step back a moment there is, I like that the idea of sort of layers of villains, kind of being aware that if you have a character that you introduce that, if they get whacked early, that they're part of an organization, part of a cabal, part of a cult, whatever that thing is that you can kind of build up. And they're like, oh, this, especially in early levels where you're like, you've got somebody like, oh, we're going to take out that dude. And then you get him and you're like, oh, that was only scratching the surface of the bigger thing. I mean, that's very classic storytelling that works really, really well for role-playing games. Now, of course, you can run into situations where, then you're, again, just sort of making cannon fodder, and there's lots and lots of these low-level bosses or lots of them that I think you can end up in stories where you get lots of hints about, like, oh, there's a super big bad and we're going to go, they're pulling the strings, and you finally get to them and you walk into a room and they're like, there it is, and you fight and it's over. And it's very board gamey and not so much role play. And I think that's going to reflect the flavor of your particular game. If you have one that's much more heavy on actual role play, or if you have one that's much more heavy on combat, and finding the flavor of what you're, because I mean, some players are going to be happy enough just to go beat something up. That's good enough for them. So you always have to figure out your team with that. But I mean, figuring out like how to, like you said, try to avoid melodrama or avoid cliche, but giving something that has some personal flavor. A thing I really like is what I think of as side quest villains, which is essentially allowing a couple of your player characters, probably not the whole party, but at least a couple of them, especially ones that are themselves really focused on fleshing out their character, is to, when they figure out their backstories, is to create some type of antagonist in it, whether it's a very overt, like violent one, or one that exerts some sort of influence on their life, or they had to escape from, and that could cause some level of friction later on. Because not every villain is somebody that you fight. I think the cathartic nature of like D&D style games is that we can confront our problems head on with swords and magic and brute force.
Yeah, we don't have to use pretense like we do in polite society.
Yeah, exactly. And so, certainly you don't want to stray entirely away from that, but there is something to be said for introducing antagonistic characters that compromise your characters in some way, that have something over them, something that keeps them, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like they can blackmail them. It could be that they have an important relationship with a family member, like the nemesis is the brother-in-law kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Or it's like, for instance, in the Pathfinder campaign that I've been in for a long time, I have this Shawanti ranger named Valor. And in Valor's backstory, he has a chief character who he has an antagonistic relationship with because he inadvertently, at a young age, killed the chief's son and was exiled from his tribe. And that is not a thing that we have ever actively approached within the 2 years of the campaign that we've been playing. But it is a piece of backstory that's always there. It's a compelling, like that backstory informs everything that my character Valor does, but it's also a piece of story that the DM has in his back pocket that if we get to the right area that he can introduce. And having something like that, to play with can be really, really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your point there about kind of either side quest villains or antagonists, maybe is a better word instead of maybe the main villain, it can be really can really add kind of a dynamic element to your sessions and your campaigns, because you could introduce a character, say like maybe in a science fiction setting, you can introduce like an info broker kind of character who has the information and will sell it to the characters, but that person is always wanting them to do like some certain job that the character is always pushing the boundaries for the characters, kind of their ethical norms or something. And it's just kind of puts them in this place where they're like, well, you know what, I don't like this guy at all, and he's doing crazy stuff, but we need whatever has at this point. And that can kind of force people into some interesting situations.
Yes. I think at any point when you can compromise your characters, I think you're closer to making fulfilling story. Mm-hmm. To any point where you can make them stop and question something and go, okay, like we need this, but but I hate that we have to do this. And it creates friction, and friction is fun when it's not in real life. But that little extra stress of being like, oh man, we really don't want to do this, but this is what we have to do. And I think especially when you can start it slowly and subtly.
Yeah.
So if you can bring it in early and they do a thing, oh, here's a fetch quest, you get a thing, cool. And they're like, oh, then we know this guy, we trust him. And then he needs another thing, and you do it, and it gets a little weirder, and then it gets a little weirder. It's the old adage about like, throwing a frog in a thing of hot water and it'll jump out. But if you put it in and warm it up slowly, and it won't, it'll just die there because it doesn't perceive the heat change. I don't think that's actually a thing that happens, but the metaphor works.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And then of course you can always, then the game master can kind of always keep it kind of that then they can make that person the ultimate villain actually at the end, kind of keep that option open if they need to do something else. And that would really then throw the characters into turmoil to realize they've been working for that villain all along or something.
Oh, yeah. That's the best stuff when you're like, oh, you did everything you thought was righteous and everything you did served the bad guy.
Yeah.
That for sure. But also I think there's something kind of enticing too about having a villain who's not very powerful. They might have influence, they might have resources that they can call upon, but in a direct fight that they're not particularly impressive. That, if the characters were like, yeah, we're 10th level and we're super, BA and we can beat this guy up, and you're like, well, is that a heroic thing to do, to beat up somebody that's maybe a decrepit old man, or maybe he's got physical issues, or maybe he's just an average dude running a booth in a small village or something? That would really call into question your character's alignment and their motivations, and could cause problems amongst the players themselves, which can be very fun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I think all of those things are great. And as a game master, hopefully if you have a great gaming group, you can just toy with a lot of those things and try some of those different ideas out in different campaigns and that, and really have fun with it, and really learn how to take your game mastering to the next level, as it were.
And if you have a player that you really trust and who does a good job of it, maybe they're the villain.
Now, I've never done that before. We'll see. I've had some players with some secrets, but never really one that was the ultimate villain.
Yeah, I mean, that's a long con to play, and I think it would be important to for that person to still maybe to begin with know that they're kind of in on something, but never actually know the plot or where things are going. So, there's a thing to be played with, but. I have never actually watched any of the Critical Role stuff. I mean, I know that there's a particularly famous bit that's made itself into the D&D lore now. That there's the actor, Joe Magliano or something like that. And as part of those storytelling things where he had a sort of a chaotic evil, like the one of those dragon guys. I forget what that race of creatures is called.
Dragonborn.
Yes, the Dragonborn, and he basically betrays his squad of people at the end of it to steal the hand of Vecna, and it's now like one of those like classic moments that caught everybody by surprise and is so good that it made it into D&D. And now, granted, I mean those are some really high level players doing some really high level stuff, but yeah, there's. Even if there are seeds of things that you can kind of work in with characters with their own secrets, with their own, again, compromise them however you can. And if they are not unified in their intentions, that can slow down playing sometimes and be frustrating, or it can create a certain kind of conflict and create interesting choices where, somebody in the room might be like, why did you just do that? And they're like, that's what I wanted to do. And really they're like, I'm fulfilling a checklist of things that are important to me and secret to the character.
No, that's great. And sometimes when you get some things like that, kind of working together, those create the lasting memories of those campaigns and stuff in our minds. All right. Well, we talked a lot about villains. I think we can move on to kind of another topic. and that is introducing surprises into the campaign. Obviously, we've been touching on that a little bit with some of our ideas in the villains, with characters having secret agendas or unknown backstories to the other characters and things like that. So I guess we can kind of just continue along some of those. What would be, I guess, some right surprises and some wrong surprises?
So, I mean, the point of surprise is that you want to shock players out of complacency, and ideally you delight them. Even if the outcome isn't great, there, a really good surprise moment is something that sticks with you. In our campaign, one that really stuck around is that we had a villain who'd been dogging us for a little while, who we just not had the opportunity to be able to take out. And when we finally did encounter him, he was in kind of a weakened state, and we killed him really, really easily. Like, our barbarian just literally smashed his head with, like, did the thunderclap on his head and just splattered it and just took the guy out. I mean, there was no combat. It was really just this one quick moment. And we're like, oh, okay. And then, like, literally this brain creature that I forget the name of offhand, but, like, leaps out of the dude's skull, hits the ground, expands, and then runs off on these crazy little legs. And our DM had a figure for it, was ready for this moment. We did not see this thing coming at all. And it elicited a full-blown, like, freak out around the table where everybody was like, oh my gosh, what in the heck is happening, right? And it was one of our most fun game sessions because, like, each character reacted their own kind of, like, nutty way to it. And what that I mean, we talk about it still because it was such a fun moment, and it paid off really well as far as what it was leading to. It actually created a sort of transitionary element because we had one player who wanted to transition to a different character, and encountering something so darn weird was easy for like our sort of like just straight fighter character to be like, you know what? This life has gotten too weird. I'm going to go do something else. And for that guy to transition into a bard. So it kind of gave a story hook to make that happen. But good surprises, they shake up the flow of gameplay, and they introduce new adventure choices, like what I was kind of talking about there. That's one way to kind of bring a hook to change things around, and they're also helpful sometimes when they remind the players that they're of their character's own mortality, and that they don't know everything about the world. That there are still surprises to be found, secrets to to show up. And like I said, even having a villain who turns out to be super weak, like that particular moment, like we were talking about a little bit earlier with the villains, that can be really memorable and be really surprising. The bad kind of surprises are like gotcha moments, where it's sequences where, like, the D&D, maybe the dungeon master, like, might abuse the rules a little bit, and whether it's just holding so firm to the rules in a rigid way that it causes the characters to not be able to do anything at all in a scene, so they're just sort of trapped in a cutscene essentially, and that really kills the fun. Or if there's anything that's sort of designed to teach a lesson, you get the occasional, like, group of of players that get a little rowdy or get a little full of themselves, and you get the occasional DM that's, like, ready to kind of put them back in their place and smack them down. And so anything that's a little vindictive like that is bad. And I think just what you were saying with that encounter with your that happened in your campaign, I think it's always good that that the surprise is kind of bigger and has larger consequences than the players thought. Yeah. And because I think sometimes it can be tempting to be, it can kind of tempting, to kind of give the players a little bit of information here. There are these rumors that there is this big, this large temple, this lost ruins or something, and you kind of build that up a little bit. And there's a kind of a temptation sometimes to have them go there and find that it's not exactly what it was. And if the surprise reveals then the thing is kind of smaller than that was built up to be, then that's very disappointing. Even though I think sometimes as a storyteller, it seems like you can be like, oh, well, wouldn't that be funny if this whole big thing was built up and then it was just, a little man behind the curtain. But you do it in a way that doesn't actually add to the story anyway. Then it's just a big letdown for the players. Yeah, it has to pay off in some way. And
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big fan of red herrings as a way of kind of fighting metagame thinking,
Yeah.
because I think if you it's kind of almost impossible for players to not be thinking with their gamer mind and not just the character mind. And so there are a lot of times where like any scrap of information or a little bit of a thing that the characters encounter, the player is starting to figure out like, oh, okay, this is probably what this thing is. I've read the monsters manual, so I know what bad guys are out there. So I know that's going to be a carry-on crawler, whatever. Like the more experienced you are in gaming, the more that metagame thinking comes in. So what I think in a kind of surprise that works really well when done well is to introduce lots of little red herrings that don't necessarily lead anywhere specific or don't lead where you'd expect them to. But they can also be kind of like what I think of as like sort of tiny story hooks. Because those things that veer off from the main story, or maybe you're just kind of distractions so that the players don't know which piece of things they just found directly leads to the next chapter of the story. But if those things, like those little hooks, resolve quickly in very small payoffs, in ways that maybe go outside of the main narrative, but enrich the characters themselves, show other corners of the world, introduce things that are surprising. And, those are the kind of moments. I think of it like if you ever watch like a very kind of like a serious, like a supernatural show, like Supernatural or the X-Files or something like that. And like once a season, there's like a comedy episode that's just like straight up really funny. And it breaks the tension of the seriousness of the rest of the show. And those scenes tend to be some of the favorite of fans because like they're just, they give you something a little different and it lets you play in a different angle. And so if you can take those red herrings and go and kind of have a funny scene or a funny play session, or something that's just a little bit sillier, or take it really dark and go a different direction and test what the characters are and their players are, willing to dip their toes into. Those things can be really fun. But I think for anything like that, it's really important that you remember to foreshadow them. Mm-hmm. Because that's kind of what I mean with the gotcha moments. Like if you've got nothing that leads up to it all, like when I talked that example I said earlier about the brain thing coming out of that guy's head, there was lead up to that. There was story elements going on. Now we weren't expecting a crazy brain thing, but we did know that the character himself wasn't acting like himself. We knew that there were a number of other people that were starting to behave kind of weirdly. And there was sort of a drug element to it, so that we knew there was a behavioral thing that was affecting them, but we didn't know that it was actually manifesting as some sort of underdark creature. So when we actually, sat down and thought about the session afterwards, we're like, oh, there was quite a bit of things leading us to this direction, but it manifested in a way that none of us expected. And that is a great payoff. So if you can figure out like how to layer in the foreshadowing, I think the best things for both the DM and the players is when 10 minutes after the crazy thing happens, somebody goes, oh man, like 4 sessions ago, this one guy said this one thing. And those are great. That's the sort of payoff epiphany that's so good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's actually, once you get experience running a lot of campaigns, you can also create some of those moments by just listening to what your players are talking about at the table, because players will come up with all of these ideas and these things, and they will connect people and places and things in the in the sessions and in the campaign that like I have never even thought of, because I think there's a tendency to kind of like I think it's kind of the game thinking or the video game kind of thinking. It is just like if something is mentioned in a session, then it has to be important. And, and a lot of times as a game master, I will just mention something because I thought it was a fun idea or a cool looking thing. I'll give something an extra description because I just happened to think of that while I was driving or taking a shower. And that would be a way to describe that in a really neat way. And I just think it's kind of fun and interesting. Well, the players will latch onto that, and then they will start to say things about it. And then if I'm paying attention to what they're saying, I can kind of take some of those things, work with those in the story, and it kind of just builds the foreshadowing in as you go along, because they're foreshadowing it, and I'm just picking up a thread that I didn't even know I was going to use until I heard them talking at the table. And then they're like, oh, I was a genius. I figured this out like 5 sessions ago. And, I just sit back and smile because everybody had fun. I got a cool idea to run with. And the players think that, this was all foreshadowed and that I had some master plan, when actually I'm just listening to what they're talking about at the table and kind of running with certain elements.
Oh, that's awesome. That's such a great point. And yeah, I'm in general, I like a certain level of interactive back and forth where, certain DMs will sort of allow player characters to invent a little bit of the world themselves.
Sure.
When I used to run the Palladium Heroes Unlimited game years ago.
And I played that a lot as well.
It was super fun, super complex. It's very Pathfinder-y. It's sort of Math the RPG. But I mean, so many fun superhero things you could do with it.
Man.
But the thing that I loved doing in those worlds was letting my players, in a moment where they're like, oh, hey, like I need to know a thing, or I need a certain kind of connection, or it'd be really helpful if I had experienced something. I would let them, make a roll and then just kind of come up with it. And be like, oh, do you know somebody? And they're like, oh, yeah. Well, my Aunt Ruby does something. And I'm like, and just roll with it and figure out the scene. And you go see Aunt Ruby, or you make a phone call or whatever. And you're getting that sense that the characters are bigger than, a sheet, and bigger than a 1-page backstory, that there's enough of a bigger world beyond them that they would be connected to. And a lot of times the players will come up with really fun, really entertaining things that discovery process is fun for the game master as well, because suddenly, you didn't have to prep a thing. You're given something new that you can play with. And a lot of times what I'd have a lot of fun with was suddenly getting to role play a character I didn't invent that just came up in the moment, and then to figure out who that character is with the player. And those are really, really fun moments.
Yeah. And that's where you had mentioned it earlier as well, is just take it as for the game master, just to take things from the characters' backstories and just weave those into the world, because I think sometimes, as a game master, especially kind of old school, you had to come up with everything. You had to think of the whole world. You kind of had to think of all this stuff. The characters seemed a little disconnected from that world. And then I think a lot of times, the game master was just like, well, nothing is a surprise. Nothing is new. Nothing's kind of happening at the table to kind of keep me interested. I'm just running, I'm here performing for my players' enjoyment, but I am kind of slogging through this thing. Where is, if you look at your, the backstory that your players come up with, and like you were mentioning, your character who had been part of an accidental death when he was younger, and that is just going to come into the story. Like if I'm running that game, that is going to come into the story when you least expect it. Right. And it is going to have consequences that you are just going to be like, oh my gosh, I knew it was going to come back, but I didn't know it was going to come back now. And to me as a game master, that just keeps me engaged, because it's like something like, oh, I didn't think of that, but I get to play with this kind of cool idea. So it's like, I didn't even know that was kind of coming, and it keeps things fresh for the game master as well.
Yes, absolutely. And again, those are the element of surprise. I love that you mentioned bringing in those side stories at weird moments when you don't think. It's not just we're going to trot back to your home city, and then we're going to go after that person. Then you're completely prepared for it. But instead, you come into a town and your roving, tribe of nomadic people are there as well. And they've already caused some level of conflict. And then you're, in the middle of it, and you didn't know that was coming. Those make compelling scenes. And also anytime that the characters have to make a choice between, do we continue on with the main plot thread? Or do we stop for a little bit and handle this issue? And what is the consequence of making one choice or the other? Those are the rock and the hard place things that the decisions you never want to have to make, but they make really good stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, I don't know, there's just always something about, like weaving in things like perhaps the party has an NPC that they've been coming to get to know and they've befriended, and he's like this jovial innkeeper or something. And then at some point, right, he just finds out that it was your character that killed his father, 22 years ago or something like that. And then it's like now he's antagonistic to the party, and it throws off the whole, kind of all of these ideas that the party was kind of playing with. And it was just like, oh yeah, that thing you put in your backstory actually has consequences in the world. And it just adds just an extra layer to things, because now we have to find a new contact. Well, this character is upset that this character caused these problems, and and the character needs to atone for that. I mean, it just brings up all kinds of complicated issues and situations that then of course lead to story and lead to role playing.
I love that the D&D 5th edition books really talk about that in backstory, and having a lot of characters that have some sort of, maybe a shame, maybe an unfortunate sequence, just something that can be lingering in the background that the game master may never use.
Yeah.
But it's there to be pulled out and again, compromise them and put them into a weird position, or just to complicate a situation where, again, like we were talking about earlier, where, fisticuffs could solve one thing, but maybe this other problem can't be solved that way. And that creates interesting conundrums.
Yeah. And I think too, you brought up a good point there. It's all about options for the game master, because you may get into a storyline that's just running really fast and keeping everybody, keeping everybody interested and entertained, and everybody's having a blast. But you could also then, if you're in some other kind of situation, you can just always just have a little something, a little ammunition that you can throw into some place and, just add another layer of complexity onto whatever you're running.
And I think what's really nice about having those things in your back pocket is they give you what I call pivot points that you can play off of if you suddenly find that your adventure is not quite going the right way, or if it's not being super satisfying for the players, or if you yourself are not having a lot of fun doing it. If you can find those, and I think we talked about this the last time I was on, but like the perennial problem in role-playing games of like feeling like you're on a rail. Feeling like you're stuck on one specific path and you can't quite get off it. If you engineer your stories with sort of a pre-planned ability to take a left turn, to move away from the main plot for a little bit, or just to kind of stop and evaluate for a moment, like, is this the adventure that this particular group of player characters really enjoys? Is this the type of game that everybody's having a good time with, or do we need to kind of fix it up or move it a different direction? If you've got a group of people who's like initially is like, yeah, man, like let's beat up a lot of things and roll a lot of dice. And then they get to like 6th or 7th level and they're like, man, we're never role playing. We're just dungeon crawling. You need to course correct and figure out how to get back to what makes it fun for everybody. And as much as possible, especially, you're the no prep game master guy. So like, you have a much greater flexibility if you're kind of going session to session or in short bursts like that to do it. If you are long-term planning, making sure that you leave yourself some back doors, making sure that there's some bailout points where, or at the very least where you can take it aside. Like we said, if you have characters that have this sort of backstory that can be used, if you're like, wow, okay, people are starting to lose attention at the table, they're bantering more about themselves, or maybe you have that one player who clearly just isn't into it anymore and they don't feel like their character has any place in all this stuff, you got to make spots where you can turn on that and fix that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and that can be especially for game masters who do a lot of planning and do a lot of preparation. That you just cannot lock yourself into this, like, we're going to do this. Like, we just can't, that leads to very crazy situations between friends. It leads to lost friends and things like that. And it leads for dull and boring role-playing games, which is one of our main concerns as well. That you really need to, if you want to plan, you have to have some places where you could diverge for a while, or take some of that planning and some of that preparation and use it in a different way that you hadn't been thinking of. If you give your players the choice of going east or west, and to the east you didn't really have anything, and they decide to go that way, well, take what you had planned in the west and just put it in the east, because they don't know that.
Yeah.
And because then they've got to make the choice, and they think, oh, well, we're on the right path. And you just kind of put those things in front of them. And I think that was something, sadly, when fortunately I got it out of my system when I was 9, 10, 11, 12, or a teenager. And fortunately I got some of that out of my system, because back then it was like, oh, you turned left, I didn't have anything left, so you're not doing anything. You want to turn this way? Oh, I don't have anything there either. You want to go there? No, don't have anything. Oh, we go this way. Oh, well, now we have stuff. Well, that was horrible. But fortunately, I got that out of my system when there wasn't much ramification, since I was playing as a 12-year-old or 13-year-old or something like that. But I think it's always important, if you're going to plan, be willing to take that plan and switch it and pivot, and give your players some real options to kind of turn down a new path.
And I think especially early in the campaign, when players are still figuring out who their characters are, having some opening for more of those spots where you can, take a pause, evaluate, and maybe turn things in a slightly different direction. Yeah. I think those are good, because most of the time, at least in my experience, you can roll up a character, write out some crazy exciting backstory, start playing that character, and find that they develop in a radically different way than what you originally wrote them as. Yeah. Whether because of just your own personality and your own style of play, whether it's because of the group dynamics, or, one of the things I always find fun is that most of the time the characters that I play end up becoming like really attached to one other character in the group, and they create their own sort of specific dynamic and playful banter or whatever. Mm-hmm. And that tends to influence a lot of what we do and how we work as a team. And a lot of that is my own personality at play in that. And it's also how the other person is playing. Like, are they super serious? Are they kind of wacky? Am I the straight man, or am I the crazy person? So taking those moments as the game master and being like, okay, I can see that this particular group plays a certain way. Let's formulate these things a little bit towards their strengths, so that they don't feel like they're playing the wrong character in it. In our campaign, one of our guys played a rogue, and he was like a rogue merchant, and he had this, he's this Swiss Army knife of skills and has all this charisma. And then we just didn't run into a lot of sequences for him to do much. It wasn't a very rogue-centric campaign, and outside of having cool flanking abilities, he just really wasn't all that useful. Great character, super fun to roleplay, but not enough opportunities to roleplay. So we eventually found a pivot point that allowed that character to exit, and he came back in as this Titan mauling, like, super gladiator who's really good at mashing things into pulp, and is a little bit B.A. Baracus style, like in the Not Getting on a Plane Hannibal, if that makes any sense to anybody who's watched A-Team. Myself big time. But his thing is he really doesn't like magic very much. And so, even though you're in a game that has a high level of magic, you as a character who's very martial and has a huge, anything that's overtly magic makes him super uncomfortable. And what makes him uncomfortable makes him barbarian rage. So, you get some really fun role-playing opportunities to have this sort of loose cannon character that everybody else has to kind of work around. But that was definitely a pivot point where we had to figure out how to allow this particular player to continue to have fun, because he just wasn't finding a vehicle for it in the character he had at the time.
Yeah. And I think that can even happen with, the setting or the direction of a campaign as well. I think a lot of times as role players and game masters, we just kind of need to loosen up a little bit, because you can start a campaign and you could have talked to all your friends and say, hey, wouldn't it be really cool if we did this campaign set in kind of this fantasy metropolis kind of thing? And, you're dealing with some kind of, the noble houses are trying to run this, big, city, and there's all kinds of trade goods and everything. And your players might be like, oh, that sounds awesome. We're going to be in the city. And you might play for 5, 6, or, 7 sessions, and then just kind of realize that like everybody likes their characters, but they're like, you know what? I think I want out of this city. Can we travel somewhere else or something? And as a game master, you just have to be just like, you know what? Why don't we just travel out of the city? Everybody likes their characters. We don't want to necessarily abandon the campaign, but yeah, why don't we have them travel outside the city and do something out there? And I think just kind of that willingness to, on the GM side as well as player side, it just to kind of roll with some things that happen. I think that is just really important, to kind of the health, of our minds and our imaginations and things like that.
Oh yeah, I had pretty much that exact same thing happened in a game I was co-GMing in this was like D&D 3.5, so it's some years back. Mm-hmm. But we initially set up the whole game world to kind of be like if Harry Potter took place in a D&D world, Yeah. And so the initial setting was like this huge grand castle, and we had all these like plans for, intrigue and mystery and stuff that would take place inside of it, and these sort of like internal political, machinations and stuff. Mm-hmm. And, I think we got 3 or 4 sessions into it, and it had just run its course. They're just like the characters needed to move beyond it. And what worked well in a sort of a narrative style, in a novel just didn't function very well. And I'm sure, if JK ever allows a Harry Potter role-playing game to be made, like that, there's a lot of fun that could be had with that. Yeah. But playing with like adultish characters with a whole bunch of powers ready to do some stuff, it just didn't work the same as like trying to play as kids in that same sort of thing. And so yeah, after a few sessions, we had to get them out and start going adventuring. And then afterwards, we had just absolutely fantastic adventures that were really, really fun. But yeah, the initial concept didn't work, and so we just had to change it.
Yeah. Well, just mentioning that if Rowling and Wizards of the Coast did an official Harry Potter source book for Dungeons and Dragons, they could all just, I think, put like $20 billion into their bank accounts instantaneously.
Instantly. It is often baffling to me that and JK is one of those people that I love Harry Potter, but oh my gosh, the less she talks in public, it feels like the better, because she's not adding positive things to the mythos a good portion of the time, or with her own particular narrative. Yeah. But yeah, no, if you wanted to bank instantaneously, 100%.
Yeah. Yeah. And we'll talk about, though, a wise decision of her keeping the ebook rights. How does that look now, 20 years after first publishing or whatever?
Very, very wise. Yeah.
Yeah, very wise. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Talk about how much revenue she's making from that. Goodness. Yeah. All right. Well, we got a little off the track there. But I did want to mention something. It's more just a silly story. You mentioned the barbarian who goes into rage when he meets something uncomfortable, and you had mentioned Heroes Unlimited. Yeah, kind of probably about 20 years ago, when I was running Heroes Unlimited, a friend of mine, he had a character that if he heard country music, he would go crazy and have to destroy the source. And so it pretty much became this whole crazy thing where if they're in a fight with an evil villain or whatever, that they all had to make sure that there was no place that music could be coming from, because of course, as a game master, I'm going to have him pass by a radio or something playing country music. So he goes crazy and has to leave the fight to destroy the source of country music.
Oh, I love that so much. That is such a great character hook, and so fun and so disruptive. That is absolutely beautiful. Yeah. And that's, I mean, that's the fun of like the superhero genre, is that you can play with mood in such a big way. You can have very, very serious stuff and then take complete left turns into something that's silly and disruptive and really amusing, but in world is awful. But for the players themselves, it's hysterical.
Yeah. And just watching, the player who's like, in this important fight and they need his abilities, they need his superpowers. And as the game master, I introduce a source of country music. You just watch the player going, I have to fight. I have to defend my friends and these innocent people. But if I'm playing my character, I have to go and destroy that radio right now. I just have to leave and destroy that radio. And it was awesome.
That's a thing that when I very first started playing D&D when I was in high school, that I struggled a little bit with, which was the compulsive sequences where I needed to play against my own wishes.
Yeah.
And I didn't do it very well when I was 14 and 15.
Nobody does when they first start.
Yeah. And later on realizing that that's one of the most fun things you can do is to have to take that abrupt left turn and do something completely different, because it really does push your role playing in a different direction. But it takes a certain level of maturity to accept that you'd have to do it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't even, it probably happens longer than I admitted, but it's certainly while I was, a preteen and then a teenager, I just played a version of what I would think, I would like to be in this fantasy world, even though I would say they had different characteristics or anything like that. Yeah. or I was always Mad Max or whatever hero in the movie that I saw, always Luke Skywalker, no matter what. Yeah. Or whatever. Yeah. But I mean, it takes a while to get out of that. I say a teenager, I probably kept doing it in my 20s too, but who knows? But anyway, you had also mentioned, since you interview so many authors on your podcast, about some different types of story structure. And I think you had a specific kind of story structure that you were wanting to talk about a little bit.
Yeah. So last time I was on, I talked a couple of different writing books I liked a lot, and one of them was Save the Cat, or Save the Cat Writes a Novel, either one. Yeah. And I didn't even realize at the time, I had not noticed that book actually got mentioned in the Dungeon Master's Guide for D&D Edition. Yeah. And I really appreciated that they made a mention of that there. But even with my own writers group and the writers that I talk to on the show, something that often comes up is that for some people that system has too many beats. It's a little too complicated. It's if they feel like they're too wrapped up in a formula. I think it's a really powerful and useful system, but I can absolutely see how you could rankle against having too many parameters around you. Yeah. So I was doing an interview recently with an author named Tricia Levenseller, and she turned me on to a system that's called the 7-point story structure from an author named Dan Wells. If anybody gets interested in this, Dan Wells originally introduced it. It's the system he uses for his own writing, and he's a very prolific writer. But there's a bunch of videos on YouTube where he's given presentations and walked through it. But what's nice about it is that it's a very straightforward 7-point system, and so it gives you a lot of latitude to explore story, but at the same time gives you a basic structure that understands kind of fits into sort of 3-act structure, beginning, middle, and end. But what that stuff means. And so I don't know, I don't want to belabor the point on this, because this is a very easy thing to Google and find more information about. But essentially it starts, the point 1 is a hook, which is basically just the starting point, that whether it's your very classic, you're in a bar and somebody comes up and says, "We need heroes," which please don't do that. But everybody knows that one. But, basically the hook is a plot question. It's essentially, oh, hey, is there a mystery? Is there something that needs to be solved? Is there a problem that we need to find an answer to? That is the plot question. That is the hook of the story. And that is the point where when your player characters are presented with something, they have to say, oh, if I don't act, does something happen? If I do act, does something better happen? And what does that lead to? That's your question. And that's what they need to, to follow up on. That should get your story going. And very quickly that leans into what Dan Wells calls plot turn 1, which is essentially what really sets the story in motion. The hook gets people interested, it gets them active, but the plot turn 1 is where they first encounter real conflict. And it's the point where the character's world changes. So that point, the hook, a character could be like, oh yeah, we saved the town from the burning fire, but I could just go back to my farm and stay there and everything would be fine, right? Mm-hmm. The plot turn 1 is the moment where they realize I can either go back to the regular world or now I have to embark on something bigger. And after that, everything changes. Whether my livelihood changes or I put myself at risk of real death, or I have to give up on some sort of connection in order to pursue this thing. But it's a sort of a moment that they go forward. And then there's a thing called a pinch point. And pinch point 1 is basically just where you as a game master, playing the part of a storyteller, has to apply pressure to the characters. So it's the moment where they have chosen to move beyond their humble origins. They are going forward with your storyline, and now you kind of have to make them hurt for it a little bit. You've got to raise the stakes a little bit, and that is usually the point where the antagonist really first appears, whether they are the grand main antagonist or they are some connection to the main villain of the piece, but lower down in that cabal of bad guys. One way or another, this is where you're going to really meet somebody who's not just a cannon fodder villain that's going to have some sort of impact on the story. And then after that, you hit the midpoint, which is where your player characters will move from reaction to action. In a novel, this would be the point where a character would understand that a lot of the stuff that they were doing early on was very much reacting to the things that were getting thrown their way. So they're like, oh, here's some bad guys. I better save the town. Oh, there's a damsel in distress. I should probably go out and rescue her. At this point in the midpoint, they have to make the choice to become proactive, where it's not just reacting to what the bad guy does, although there's always still elements of that, but where they now have to have the agency as characters to say, no, we have to make real decisions. We have to figure out where this is going. We have to, make our way through the world, and we have to decide what that outcome means for us, not so much that another person's like, this is the command of like, you need to go and do this thing. They have to make up their mind for themselves what that is and figure out what it might cost them in order to actually go after that pursuit. Does that all make sense so far?
Yeah. I know it might be a little complicated, but I think people, if they start thinking about movies that they've watched or books that they've read, they can see some of those elements come through.
Oh yeah, the beauty of, and this very much works for 7-point story structure. It very much works for Save the Cat as well. If you go back and watch some of your favorite movies or reread from some of your favorite stories with these structures in mind, you can really clearly find these beats in the stories. And whether or not they were intentional on the part of the creator, they're very distinct. One of my favorite examples for it is The Crow, the classic Brandon Lee movie from the 90s. If you go back with a 7-point structure or like really Save the Cat, and Save the Cat didn't exist then, but if you sit down with Save the Cat and watch The Crow, it hits that beat for beat for beat for beat. You will see all of it there. And it's really eye-opening to go, okay, this doesn't feel like any other movie out there necessarily, but the bones are the same. Just like every human is based on mostly the same structure, but yet we're all different and look different and act different. We're still, created from the same building blocks. And that's what you'll see from these systems, is that every story has a lot of these things in common. And if you just look for it, you'll find it. And that can be really, really informative about story in general and how you can do it in an interactive session.
Yeah. And even though I'm the no prep game master guy, I do kind of mention that it is important to know some basics about story structure, even if you're not planning them out like you're writing a novel or something or a screenplay. That if you can just see certain points that are happening in your campaigns or in your sessions, and you can just use those those structure points or those plot points or whatever, because you just know how stories kind of work. You can just see kind of an opportunity pop up, and you can just apply more pressure or something, whatever kind of the structure calls for at that time.
Yeah, I mean, just knowing what those things are, even if it's you have the loosest sketch of what it is and you're just filling in the details, like, session to session, it's still going to give you a much greater sense of what that story can be. And I think what's also great about these things is that, we talked earlier about having pivot points. If you know sort of the story structure, plot points, you're also aware that these things can be pivot points too, especially that midpoint where they move from reaction to action. That's the place where your characters really figure out what their goal is, like what they define as the goal for themselves as a group. And it also, like, the midpoint's a great place to expand the scope of the story, where you can say, okay, up until this point, you've had a very specific, vision of the world. And at this point, you might realize that the stakes are much higher than you previously realized, and much bigger things are going on. And that's going to affect what that goal is. And that's also going to give you a moment to stop and reflect on, what do these player characters want and like, and how are they enjoying this? And maybe at the midpoint, we need to redirect things a little bit so that they're playing to their strengths rather than playing to what you originally wanted to start with, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think probably a good example of that reaction to action, kind of just illustrated, if you think of a Star Wars A New Hope, that Luke is just reacting to a whole bunch of things until he decides, well, I have to rescue Princess Leia. Then once that happens, then he becomes very active in making decisions of rescuing the princess, getting off the Death Star, destroying the TIE fighters, destroying the Death Star, and he becomes very active. At the beginning, he was very reactive. And so I think that kind of illustrates that kind of point as well. And it is interesting to see how many stories actually follow that, and how that then hooks the audience and draws people into that.
Right. And he also proves the point about discovering a goal and expanding, his scope of the world too, because once they actually find the Death Star, then they realize, he didn't go out looking to save the Rebel Alliance from a giant destructive ball of death. He didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah.
So at the midpoints, when they really discover, like, our biggest threat is this giant weapon, and this is a thing we're going to have to take out, that creates a goal, that creates an expansion of that world. And like you said, then he suddenly has to become a much more active participant, rather than just, when he leaves Tatooine, he's reacting to the death of his aunt and uncle, and his, like, understanding that there's no life left for him yet. And there's a proactive choice there, but really it's mostly him going, I don't know what else to do, so give me that lightsaber and let's get out of here.
Yeah, and then even going to Alderaan is just like, oh, well, we got the message, why not go, and now, Obi-Wan's going, so I'll just go with him until he wants to actually, rescue the princess. And then, then the whole big world starts to be revealing. And I think, if you can do something like that as a game master, or even a shadow of that, like we've been talking about, just adding in some bits of those things, your players will eat it up.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And then, that story structure of the 7 point, one of the things that's nice about it is that the next two elements are essentially sort of reflections of the early ones, because you have another pinch point and you have another plot turn. So the pinch point 2 follows the midpoint, and it's basically the darkest moment in the story. It's the point where you take something big from the characters or from their world, and you kind of make them hurt. You reinforce the goal while also reinforcing the stakes. And it reflects similar to, like, the Save the Cat, where there's this thing called the whiff of death. It's that moment in the story where you introduce a greater sense of mortality, and that things could go off the rails. Like when I mentioned the crow earlier, that's a moment, that sort of whiff of death happens when the bad guy actually shoots the actual crow, the physical bird, and suddenly Eric Draven discovers that he isn't not impervious anymore, that he actually can be hurt. That gives you that sense of, oh no, like one of the best defenses he had is gone, and now things are that much more threatening. For Luke Skywalker, it's seeing Obi-Wan die.
Yeah.
Suddenly everything is darker, everything is scarier. Alderaan being destroyed is abstract for him. He knows that's bad, but he's never been there. He has no connection to it. But Obi-Wan he cares about, and seeing him die changes the situation as well. So yeah, those moments they're tied together, but yeah, they're all kind of wrapped up.
Yeah.
And then you get like the plot point or plot turn 2, which is basically that's the moment where like the characters get whatever information or tool that they really need in order to achieve whatever that goal is they figured out at the midpoint. So if that's in Star Wars, that's the moment where they get the information where they figure out what the vulnerability on the Death Star is, where they need to hit it, how they need to attack it. And suddenly they know, okay, this is the thing we have to do. We have that one piece of vital information. Now you can mess with your characters and give them that vital information and have it turn out to be either incorrect or misleading, or maybe a little bit more nebulous than they realized and not quite enough to act on, and you can still reveal more, but you're giving them that tool or that MacGuffin that allows them to, reach the end stage. And then the last point is just the resolution. I mean, that's where the climax of the story is. That's where you pay off as much of the story as possible, at least that particular arc. And that's where you really need to see the impact of your character's actions, where they need to not only be like, oh, we beat up the bad guys, but real things took place, that are bigger than us and that have real ramifications. And that's where you get to play with, oh, did they make the right choices? Did they make the world better? Did they just do things for themselves? And are they coming out the other end of this particular adventure similar to who they were at the beginning, or are they radically different?
Yeah. And I think those bring up a couple of things that might pose a problem to a game master. You mentioned in there, I believe, raise the stakes. Sometimes that's a concept that some game masters and role players kind of miss, and that kind of the idea, if we want to, continue nerding out on movies and things, it's really it's easy to illustrate from the movie, say Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, the original one, that Khan is out for revenge and he's going to kill Captain Kirk, and he's going to kill maybe several hundred of Kirk's crewmen, but and that's awful and that's bad, but they give him the Genesis device as well in the story, which means if Khan wins, he could use the Genesis device on Earth and destroy all life on Earth or something like that. And so they raise the stakes. So now the Captain Kirk is not just trying to stay alive or to save his ship. He's trying to save the galaxy, right? And so that's kind of an idea that some of these, the different story structure can help you add in to your role-playing games, where your players, your characters might be out for some gold coins. Then you add in something that kind of hooks them to maybe a village or an inn where they have friends. And then you can raise the stakes to a place to where, guess what? This one character's country or nation might fall, or the king or the queen might fall if you don't do this thing and don't see this thing through. And I think that's sometimes, we see it all the time in story, but it can just be kind of in the background that we don't even realize, that is happening.
Yeah, we see the escalation constantly, but yeah, when you're constructing a story for a game, I mean, I think because oftentimes you're thinking about it a session at a time and trying to figure out how it builds, and also like how it matters to your players. I mean, a problem you can run into, especially if you have an older and cynical game group, is, introducing the big picture thing where like, oh no, the whole civilization might fall. And if you have a bunch of like chaotic neutral characters, and you're like, I don't care. Like
I'm going back to the forest.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean that's you have to figure out what appeals to them directly, and does this stuff matter? Did they meet enough NPCs that they grew connected to? Does their character have a real connection to a particular place or city or nationality or whatever it is? Or are they going to be nihilist enough to go through and be like, I don't know, like we can survive really well on our own and we're super wealthy and powerful now, so why don't we just let this whole thing burn and walk? Why put ourselves in this situation? It's important to think about those motivations. There's a thing that my current game master has gotten frustrated with our group about. I think I may have mentioned this in the last time I was on to you, but it's just that that we're a bunch of 40-year-old guys playing 20-year-old characters, and he expected us initially to play as crazy, adventurous, throw yourself in the line of fire, heroes, and we think of ourselves as #team not dead. Our whole purpose, our rule number 1 is don't die. And rule number 2 is maybe accomplish the mission, but remember, don't die. And so, we go into certain circumstances where it's like, oh, the heroic thing would be to throw ourselves into a situation where we could create self-sacrifice. Our team's not about that. That's not, we'll sacrifice for each other because the group is tight like that. But when it comes to the greater world around it, most of our characters have some sort of exile trait. We're all disenfranchised. And even the people that we've fought for along the way, we don't necessarily always like all that much. So it's hard to use that as a motivation for our group when you're like, oh, the greater good. And like my character is the only good aligned character, and he's good in a very pragmatic way. And he's like, because he likes to be useful. And so he sees himself as a tool of good, but is not necessarily super empathetic towards any of these groups that we're actively trying to rescue from harm. So yeah, it's a thing you have to figure out with your group and find out what that natural thing is.
Yeah, and you just gave a window into Gen X psychology for the boomers and millennials who are listening to the podcast.
That's probably very, very true. Yeah.
No, I think that's great. And because, you could, as the game master, you could say, if you don't do this, this whole city will burn to the ground, and your character, the players could just be like, and then you have to be like, that means that little old lady you met in a random encounter that you helped, you helped across the street and then bought her some bread because she was like poor. She'll die too. Then the players are like, oh, we got to save the city.
Yep, that is
so you have to look to see
what happened with ours.
Doing.
Yeah, our group absolutely had that, where there's like the initial village where we all met. Like, we don't really care that much about that village. But there was one particular NPC that we found very quirky and fun. Mm-hmm. And when that guy was somebody who was abducted as part of a group with a bunch of giants, then yeah, we went running and gunning after them and ready to annihilate people because we were not having that. Yeah. Figuring out, that's part of the point of making really fun and interesting NPCs as well, is figuring out like what makes a character that people care about. And it's rarely that they were told to care about them, right? It's rarely that like in your backstory, like, oh, you think this guy's great. And they're like, okay, cool, I think this guy's great. Yeah. But it's more that they found something about them that stood out in their mind and made them endearing in some way. Figuring that stuff out will go a long way towards, creating real character motivation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, you mentioned the resolution as well. And I think this can kind of often be overlooked, that, because at first it might seem boring. You hit the climax, you resolve all this massive action and whatever your campaign was, even if it was a small, dungeon crawl that was, just kind of ended on a high note, or a big, huge, epic campaign that, resulted in the saving of the world or whatever. That it is so important to to include kind of a resolution phase where you can have kind of a dropping in action, and you can have the players and do things with their characters, kind of responding to what they just did, and it just adds just a layer of satisfaction into the story. And I'm thinking, I'm revealing how much of a movie nerd I am, but looking at a movie, say, this will be an obscure reference maybe, but a movie, The Octagon, starring Chuck Norris from the late 70s or 1980 maybe. Chuck Norris kills the villain, and what happens right after the villain falls dead? You know what happens? The credits roll. and it felt like it was incomplete, right? Because you're like, well, I mean, maybe it's not the greatest movie in the world, but I kind of like Chuck Norris. I wanted to see what was going to happen to his character. Well, guess what? We don't know. Like there was no resolution. Maybe bring kind of up a little bit to, closer to us, say Star Trek Voyager, the last episode of Star Trek Voyager. You have this huge plot, goes on for 2 hours, big special event, wrapping up 7 seasons of the TV show. And they get home and the credits roll. And you're like, well, what happened to Janeway? What happened to Chakotay? What happened to 7 of 9? And you just don't know. And it's just
so frustrating. Yeah,
absolutely. So you can kind of see why you think, oh, well, nothing's happening, so it's boring. But actually, if you allow the players to kind of play out their characters in that resolution, you'll get a much more satisfying experience.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you again, like Consequence, showing like what they did and why it mattered and what the impact was, is a big deal. Showing that things, it's not just like, I mean, there's been plenty of video games way back in the day that you did just beat a thing and you're like, and the game's over. There's a fantastic game from like the PlayStation 1 era that's called Soul Reaver. And it was a great game for its time period, but it wasn't done whenever it got released. So they, so the ending, just like you kind of face the final boss, and then there's just this weird half a cut sequence and then some text on the screen, and it's like one of the biggest story letdowns ever for a game that was so satisfying otherwise. That stuff is awful. There's if for people who are fantasy readers, there's a fantastic novel called Kings of the Wild by an author named Nicholas Eames. And it's very much if you dig D&D, and also if you have kind of an appreciation for, say, like 70s arena rock, like that's sort of used as a kind of story element around that novel. But it's got a great denouement. It's got a great wrap up to the end of it, where you get a satisfying end for all those characters and the resolution of that story. Even as it does set up the next novel, even if you never read the next novel, you would still get a really satisfying ending to it. It's a good example of kind of how to do that.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's great. And now we've been talking for a long time, Adron. I think one other thing you had mentioned, we are recording this while we are under lockdown from the global pandemic and everything. And, not to make light of that at all. But I've had to move my gaming group online. I think you mentioned you had to move your gaming group online. Yep. Maybe just a couple quick tips for somebody who's trying to keep gaming, even though maybe the world's burning around them.
Yeah. So my group, we moved our Pathfinder campaign to Roll20, to that platform. And that's the first time I've used any of the online things. I mean, I know there's also Fantasy Grounds and Astral and I haven't used those other ones yet. Roll20 is pretty rad. There's a lot of really cool stuff that thing can do. And it's certainly in Math the RPG, which is Pathfinder, like having these different sort of macros that you can build into it to handle all the rolls and do all the math for you. That part's cool. But it took us like several evening sessions of just sitting together and trying to figure out how that platform worked, how to make our characters work. So one of the first things I've taken away from it, and we were just discussing this as a group last night, is I think it would have been brilliant to make the jump to Roll20 with a first level campaign. Yeah. Because I think creating the characters in that system would have been, because they've got sort of a wizard for it. And I think that would have worked really well. The characters wouldn't have been that complicated at that point, and we would have learned how to use the system while we were at a fairly rudimentary level. But we jumped into it with 12th level characters. And 12th level characters with a ton of abilities and things that were complicated enough to figure out when we were on paper. And suddenly we had to figure out ways to make them roll. Like, I mean, I mentioned my archer character, and if he's hasted, he gets like 5 attacks in a round. And there's so many different buffs and things to keep track of with it. And a lot of that stuff, Roll20 can do really well. For me, it got really clunky. And so I ended up like going in and coding my own macros so that I could do these specific roles. And I can do that to a degree because I've got a coding background, so I could sort out some of it, but I didn't want to. It's not how I wanted to spend a whole evening, trying to figure it out. So My first thought with it is that if possible, if you're making that jump to one of those platforms, is to start low level, because I think you're going to have a lot less complication and a lot less difficulty figuring things out if you start low. I will also say that in using Roll20, it has a built-in system for cameras, like webcams and audio and stuff. But it slows the game way down, like slows the actual app way down. It's much better to use a secondary system to do it. We use Zoom, which is what the two of us are recording this on right now. Mm-hmm. But I paid the $15 a month to get the Pro Zoom account and use that for all of our team. It works way, way better. It's functioned really well running that in tandem with Roll20. And it's made it really fun. I mean, we talked about this before we got going, but I'm super extroverted and I miss people real bad right now, being stuck in my home all the time, and having the ability to sit down with my friends and play the game and see them and laugh with them. And it really, really helps a ton. So I'm so grateful for this system right now in doing it. But the other thing that I think about with it is just also being conscious of those online systems can make a bunch of things a lot easier, but they can also really make it feel like just a board game. If you're not careful, because you've got, a fancy map up and you're just moving the characters around on it. So being conscious of not letting the dungeon crawls or, the things that are grid based overwhelm the play, and letting people get back to role playing. It's definitely, it takes some work and some experience and some practice to kind of figure out what that is, but go into it as much as possible thinking about the fact that you don't want it to become just, unless you're into that, you don't want it to become just a digital board game, that you want to focus on the role playing and let people be characters.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the first couple times that I did it, I just realized, because I'm the game master, I was just realizing that I wasn't describing things like I had normally done, that I would at the table. And I had to kind of just get used to not getting, some body language clues from people and different things like that, I just take for granted when I'm sitting across the table from somebody. This is, there really is no excuse to stop role playing at this point. We have so many options, and I'm also just wishing 2 years ago I would have bought $100 of Zoom stock, but that's enough.
Yeah. Oh my God, so much so. Yeah, absolutely. If we had all been that prescient for it, it'd been great. Yeah. I will say too that a couple of my friends have 9 and 10-year-old daughters, and they have also just recently, they got into D&D a couple of months before this all happened. Oh, yeah. And they have just started using Roll20 to play together. And they're playing very low level characters, and one of the dads is doing the DMing and stuff. But when they were missing their own game of it, and then they watched their dad play, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, we want to do this too." Yeah. So now they're playing together on Roll20 and using Zoom, and they're doing Zoom calls with each other so they can spend time together. And it's really, really cool. I'm seeing the nerdery continue to the younger generation is awesome, and seeing them adapt to the situation just like we've had to, and seeing them get excited about it has been really, really fun.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so glad everybody can keep role playing and that. And just really hoping too that everybody listening is safe and that their families are well and everything during this time. But well, Adron, I have had you on the line for a long time. Where can people listen to your podcast and find out more about you?
Sure. So the podcast is called Fictitious. It's the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm going to go right into my announcer voice here. You can find it at fictitiouspodcast.com. It's Fictitious Pod on all the social medias. If you just want to interact with me about anything nerdy, because I'm a giant geek, my Twitter handle is @Adron Buske. That's ADRON
All right. And I will include links to your podcast and to your Twitter and all of that in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who's listening can just hop over to dicegeeks.com and they should be able to find out where you are at and listen to your podcast. Well, Adron, just thank you so much for being on the show again.
Always a pleasure, Matt. Thank you for having me.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Adron today. It was just a blast to have him on the show again. Oh my goodness, we covered a lot of topics, I know. So you are going to want to head over to dicegeeks.com and check out the show notes for this episode. I have linked to Adron's podcast as well as some resources to help you become a better game master. Now, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you'll get an update on what I am doing here at Dice Geeks. Hey guys, it is my pleasure to bring you a new and exciting guest each and every week. If you enjoy the podcast, I would really like to hear about that. You can email me. My email is simply matt@dicegeeks.com. You can just drop me a line and let me know that you enjoy the show. Also, if you want to do some other things to help support the show, you can tell a friend about the show. You can leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast right now. You can also subscribe. Those really help podcasts, guys. I know it doesn't seem like much, but those really help the show. And you can also support the show financially at patreon.com/dicegeeks. Each and every patron I receive is just a vote of confidence that I know that there is somebody out there who really wants me to keep making this show. I thank you so much for listening. And until next time, keep gaming.